The 13 names removed from the 1870 census. A historical narrative. Chapter 1. The letter in the wall. In the summer of 1870, a census taker named Joseph Carey walked through a freed community in rural Virginia and wrote down 112 names. He recorded their ages, their occupations, the value of their land. He did his job. When his field record reached the Central Census Office in Washington, 13 of those names were gone. Not crossed out, not marked deceased, not noted as relocated. Removed, as though they had never been written down at all. And the families whose names were missing were the same families whose land was being challenged in county administrative court. That is where this story begins. 1. The Tin Box. A record that survives 16 years inside a wall has to be placed there deliberately. In the spring of 1887, a laborer named Percy Halt was contracted to renovate a series of buildings on the eastern edge of Richmond, Virginia, buildings that had served, during the brief years of Reconstruction, as federal administrative offices. The buildings were being repurposed, stripped of their former function the way the era itself had been stripped, methodically, of its ambitions. On a Tuesday in March, Percy was pulling apart an interior partition on the third floor of what had been the Albemarle County Relief Office, the east wall of the records room, when his tools met something that was not plaster and not wood. A tin box, tucked into the cavity behind the wall, wrapped in oilcloth. He opened it. He read what was inside. Then he wrapped it back up, carried it across the city, and brought it to a man named Thomas Dray. "Why bring it to me?" Thomas asked. Percy looked at him steadily. "Because I read what's in it, and because you are the only man I know of in this city who prints things other people would rather not have printed." He paused. "And because whoever put that in that wall, they put it there hoping someone would find it someday. I don't think they meant for it to disappear again." Inside the tin box, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it legible through 16 years of wall and weather, was a letter. The writing was small, dense, and precise, the hand of someone accustomed to official correspondence. It had been written in the spring of 1871, in a small federal office in the Virginia countryside, while rain tapped against the window and the smell of tobacco drifted in from the room next door. It was addressed to whoever finds this, and to the truth that deserves to exist somewhere, even if it cannot exist in the light. It was signed, EAV, April 9th, 1871. Thomas Dray read it for 4 hours without stopping. When he finally set it down, the lamp had burned low and the street outside was completely silent. He sat for a long time with one hand pressed flat against the last page. Then he reached for his notebook. 2. Who wrote it? The letter had been written by a man named Elias Voss. Elias Voss was 37 years old in 1871, a native of western Pennsylvania, married to a woman named Clara, father of 2 daughters whose names appeared once near the end of the letter with a weight that made Thomas stop reading and stare at the wall for a full minute. He was a mid-level functionary in the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, what most people called simply the Freedmen's Bureau. His job was paperwork, land reconciliation, field inspections, the administrative infrastructure of a federal mandate that was, by 1871, being systematically dismantled by the political forces that had never wanted it to exist. He was not a hero. He said so himself in the letter, in language that left no room for revision. "I am not a brave man. I want to be honest about that because I think the record should be honest, even when honesty is not flattering. I have looked the other way before. I have told myself the things that men tell themselves when they want to continue working within systems that ask them to be less than they ought to be." He had been assigned, in the winter of 1870, to conduct a routine reconciliation review, cross-checking local census field records against submitted data for a series of rural Virginia districts. Low-priority work, administrative housekeeping. He was not supposed to find anything important. What he found was this: 13 names that appeared in Joseph Carey's original field enumeration for a community called Hallow Creek did not appear in the final submitted census record. The total count had been adjusted from 112 to 99, and the adjustment had been made in the records office after the fieldwork was complete by someone with access to the final submission documents and the authority to alter them. He recognized the names. Among the 13 missing were the adult members of 4 specific families, the 4 families whose land parcels were at the center of the most active administrative title challenges in the Southwest County District. Families who, if they did not appear in the census, could be argued, in the specific, narrow, technical language of the pending challenges, to have no established claim to continuous occupancy of the land in question. This was not a clerical error. A clerical error removes one name. It does not remove exactly the 13 names most useful to remove and leave the 99 least useful ones intact. This was a mechanism. 3. What Hallow Creek was. You will not find Hallow Creek on most maps from this period. This is not an accident. What it was, in the years between 1866 and 1871, was a community of freed people who owned their land, not rented it, not sharecropped it. Owned it, with documentation, deeds, filed records, bureau allocations, title transfers that had occurred during the wartime period and had been registered, imperfectly but genuinely, in the legal record. By 1869, there were 47 structures at Hallow Creek. A church, built first, from timber that the men of the community had cut themselves in the evenings after field hours were done. A school, established by a woman named Ruth Colby, running with 31 students ranging in age from 4 to 17. A grain storage facility, a cooperative smithy, a mill, built over 18 months by a man named Abel Dupree, who had taught himself to read from a Bible he had hidden for 11 years, and who maintained the community's financial records with a precision that would have impressed any bank examiner. The community was not disorderly. There is no record in any document Thomas was later able to find of any crime of violence originating from Hallow Creek in the 5 years of its existence. Its land titles, though complicated in places, were more solidly documented than those of half the white farms in the surrounding area. It was uncomfortable to certain men in Albemarle County, not because it was in any legal sense illegitimate, but because it was successful, because 230 people who had been told, explicitly, implicitly, in every language available to a society that wished to communicate such things, that they were incapable of self-governance, had built something that governed itself, fed itself, educated its children, maintained its own records, and showed every indication of intending to continue doing so. That is not what certain men had planned. 4. The 3 men and the mechanism. Elias Voss's letter named them. Thomas Dre's investigation confirmed them. The first was Warren Nance, county land assessor for Albemarle County. 51 years old in 1871, a former Confederate officer, a man of considerable personal charm that coexisted by every account with a complete absence of concern for the welfare of any human being, he did not consider his social equal. The county land assessor, in the particular political geography of post-war Virginia, determined which prior claims on a given parcel were considered legally valid, and which were considered procedurally defective and therefore void. In a period when the legal status of land transferred, allocated, or abandoned during and after the war was genuinely, deeply complicated, and when the people whose claims depended on certain interpretations of that complexity were the least likely to have access to legal representation, the county land assessor was, in practical terms, a man who could make property appear and disappear. In the autumn of 1869, Nance initiated a systematic review of land titles in the southwest corner of Albemarle County. The review was legal. The methodology was not. He identified within the first 2 months a series of what he termed title discrepancies in the parcels occupied by Hallow Creek. The discrepancies were, by any rigorous legal standard, largely fabricated. the result of selectively applying procedural interpretations to documents that, when read honestly, supported the community's claims. But they were fabricated with extraordinary care, constructed from real ambiguities in real documents, magnified and reframed until they became, in the specific legal grammar of county administrative procedure, actionable. His preliminary findings, filed in November 1869, stated in the careful language of official assessments that the Hollow Creek land titles were under review and that pending resolution, no improvements to existing structures could be legally permitted. No improvements. The community's grain storage facility, partially damaged in a September storm, could not be repaired. The new wing of the school, framed, roofed, waiting only for interior work, could not be completed. The road that connected the community to the county market town, which flooded every spring and had been the subject of a 2-year improvement effort, could not be touched. The community could not grow. More importantly, it could not maintain itself adequately against the ordinary attrition of time and weather and need. The second man was Court Harwell, a supervisory official within the Bureau itself, nominally a colleague of Elias Voss, practically something else entirely. He had been at the Bureau since 1866. He knew, better than almost anyone, which records could be altered and which could not, which processes could be circumvented, and which of his colleagues could be trusted to look the other way. Between November 1869 and February 1871, a period of 15 months, Harwell quietly altered the administrative classification of the Hollow Creek parcels. He shifted documents between categories. He added procedural notations that required additional review steps before any federal assistance could be authorized. He delayed responses to inquiries. He rerouted correspondence. None of these actions, taken individually, would have been sufficient. Any one of them could be attributed to bureaucratic backlog, administrative oversight, the ordinary dysfunction of an overextended and underfunded federal agency. Together, they formed a seal. The community of Hollow Creek, legally entitled to certain forms of federal protection under the Bureau's mandate, found itself by the spring of 1870 in a situation where every request for assistance produced a response explaining that additional documentation was required, that the matter was under review, that the appropriate official had not yet been able to attend to it. Abel Dupree filed 23 formal requests with the Bureau between January 1870 and March 1871. Each one was received, acknowledged with a form letter, and then disappeared into the administrative structure that Harwell had carefully constructed. Ruth Colby wrote 6 letters directly to the Bureau's district superintendent. 4 copies survived, kept by Ruth herself in a small book in her careful self-taught hand. Thomas Dray found them eventually. The letters are precise, thoughtful, and scrupulously reasonable. They describe specific problems: the flooded road, the grain storage, the children who had nowhere adequate to study during the winter months, the elderly members of the community who needed medical attention that the community could not provide without assistance. None of them received a response. The third man was Douglas Ver, a Virginia state legislator, moderate in his public statements, careful never to commit to the specific interpretation of lawful order that would have been most descriptively accurate. He provided money and political protection. Nance provided the mechanism. Harwell provided the institutional cover. Ver provided the certainty that if something went wrong, if some unwanted question was raised, if some federal inspector arrived at an inconvenient time, the right conversation would happen in the right room. He was never in the county when anything happened. He was always visibly elsewhere, engaged in activities that produced witnesses and documentation. In March of 1871, Ver introduced a bill in the Virginia House of Delegates. The bill concerned, on its face, the regulation of land tenure in counties below a certain population threshold. It spoke of parcel regularization procedures and administrative consolidation of disputed agricultural holdings. It did not mention Hollow Creek by name. To anyone who understood the underlying mechanics, it meant one thing. The legal mechanism for resolving title disputes would transfer from federal jurisdiction to county jurisdiction. From the federal system, imperfect, corrupt in places, being actively dismantled, but nominally operating under a legal framework that offered some protection, to the county system, which was Warren Nance. The bill passed in April 1871. What Elias Voss saw. The visit to Hollow Creek had not been Harwell's idea. A federal investigator in Washington named George Alden had received a copy of one of Ruth Colby's letters through channels Harwell had not anticipated and could not fully explain afterward. Alden was the kind of official who creates problems for people like Harwell simply by doing his job correctly. He assigned a field inspection to the nearest bureau office with available personnel. That office was Elias Voss's. Harwell learned about the assignment after Elias had already received it. By then, there was no clean way to prevent it without creating exactly the kind of visibility he had spent 2 years avoiding. He managed the situation the only way he could, ensured the inspection was framed as routine, ensured the paperwork included carefully prepared summaries, suggesting the Hollow Creek situation was of a familiar, minor administrative character, and relied on the reasonable assumption that Elias Voss would read those summaries, make the appropriate procedural notes, and return to his office without asking questions that hadn't been put in front of him. It was a reasonable assumption. It was wrong. Elias arrived in the Southwest County in the first week of April 1871. He expected to find what the summaries had described: a community in modest disarray, documentation problems amenable to bureaucratic resolution. He found something different. He found a community that was holding together, not because the pressures on it were manageable, but because the people within it had decided, with what he described in his letter as a collective and unanimous stubbornness that I can only describe as magnificent, that they would not allow it to fall apart regardless of what it cost them. On the second day, Abel Dupree walked him through 16 months of filed requests, organized in order by date, cross-referenced with the form letters of acknowledgement that were the only responses they had received. He did this without heat, without accusation, with the same quiet, meticulous precision with which he maintained the community's financial records, simply laying out document by document what had been done and what response had followed. On the third day, Elias met Ruth Colby. She was teaching a class of 11 children in the church, because the school wing, half finished and unwalled on 2 sides, was too cold for regular use. She dismissed the children early when she recognized the bureau identification he carried. She had things to say to a bureau inspector that she did not want the children to hear. What she said was not accusation. It was a systematic account of the 2 years since the review had begun, delivered in a tone that was entirely controlled and from which any trace of pleading had been deliberately and visibly stripped. She described the grain storage, the road, the 3 members of the community who had died the previous winter from illnesses that adequate medical access might have prevented. She described the families that had given up and moved. She told him that when she had written to the bureau, she had believed someone would read her letters and respond, that for a year she had continued to believe this, that she had eventually stopped believing it, not because she had given up hope, but because she had come to understand that the absence of response was not an accident or an oversight. It was a policy. "I want to know," Ruth Colby said to Elias Voss in the church at Hollow Creek in the first week of April 1871, "whether you are here to help us or to document us." Elias wrote this sentence down in his letter. Then he wrote, in the small, precise hand of a man choosing his words with unusual care, "I did not have an honest answer to give her." On the 4th day, a woman named Henrietta came to find him at the rooming house where he was staying. She was approximately 60 years old, small and thin, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed an action many times before deciding to perform it. She brought a document. It was a copy of a letter from Court Harwell to Warren Nance, dated November 14th, 1869. The original had been obtained by a man who worked as a janitor in the county administrative offices. a man who had recognized, with the particular alertness of someone who understands that the papers he is cleaning around have direct consequences for his life, that the letter was something that should not be allowed to simply exist in the ordinary course of things. Elias read the letter. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the interior pocket of his coat, close against his body. The letter was not written in the administrative language of careful implication that characterized most documents he worked with. It had been written in the confidence of a man communicating with someone he trusted completely. It described, in ordinary language, the plan, the title review, the administrative delay, the coming state legislation, the expected timeline, the intended outcome. And it described, in a passage Elias transcribed verbatim into his own letter with a note that he could not bring himself to summarize it in his own words, the expected fate of Hollow Creek. The land will be available for reassessment in the third quarter once the occupants have been administratively displaced. The improvements they have made will be assessed at reduced value given the disputed status, which means acquisition cost will remain favorable. V is prepared to move quickly when the time comes. V was Douglas Vare. The improvements they had made. The church, the school, the grain storage, the carefully tended fields, would be assessed at reduced value because Nance controlled the assessment. Because a community that had been officially designated as occupying disputed land had no legal standing to claim fair market value for what it had built. 230 people. 5 years of construction, reduced to a favorable acquisition cost. Elias sat with this for a long time. Then he took out his pen and began to write. 6. The 13, their names, as they appeared in Joseph Carey's original field enumeration, and as they do not appear in the final submitted 1870 census record. Abel Dupree, age 44, farmer and accountant. His wife Constance, age 41. Their son Marcus, age 19, their daughter Eveline, age 16. Samuel Greer, age 52, farmer. His wife Dorothy Greer, age 48. Their son William, age 22. Patience Hood, age 36, head of household, seamstress and field laborer. Her children, Caleb, age 11. Naomi, age 8. Thomas, age 5. James Portwood, age 39, farmer. His wife Harriet, age 35. 13 people, 4 families. The 4 families whose land parcels were the primary targets of Nance's administrative challenges. Their houses remained standing. Their fields remained tended. Their children continued walking to Ruth Colby's school. Their names were gone from the federal record. 7. The letter. He could not send Elias understood, by the end of his 4th day at Hollow Creek, that submitting a report through established bureau channels was not a viable option. Harwell controlled the channels. Whatever he submitted would reach Harwell first, be evaluated against what could be neutralized, and be either suppressed or managed into irrelevance before it could reach anyone with both the authority and the independence to act. So he wrote a letter, not addressed to anyone specific, or rather, addressed to anyone specific enough to understand it. Anyone who knew how the Bureau worked. Anyone who could read the names and understand what they meant. He wrote it over 2 nights at the small desk in the rooming house while the rain came and went and came again. He wrote it as a witness, not as an advocate. He described what he had seen, what he had been told, what the documents in his possession demonstrated. He described Ruth Colby and Abel Dupree and the 16 months of unanswered requests. He described Nance and Harwell and Vare, and how the 3 pieces fit together. He included a full transcription of the Harwell-Nance correspondence. Near the end of the letter he wrote, "I cannot send this through the Bureau. Harwell will see it. I cannot send it to a newspaper, not now, not from here. It would reach the wrong hands before it reached the right ones. So I am going to do the only thing I can think of, which is to put this somewhere where it might survive until a time when someone who needs it can find it. I don't know when that will be. I don't know who you are, if you are reading this. But whatever you do with it, use it. I have spent 4 years not using what I knew. That is 4 years I cannot have back. Don't spend your own that way." He wrapped the papers in oilcloth. He placed them in a tin box. He tucked the box into the wall cavity behind the plaster of the records room on the 3rd floor of the Albemarle County Relief Office. Then he returned to Richmond, filed a partial report, watched it get suppressed, lost his bureau position 6 months later, and was reassigned to a field office in Kentucky. He stayed there 4 years and then left the bureau entirely. The letters stayed in the wall for 16 years. 8. The investigation. And what Thomas Dray found. Thomas Dray did not publish immediately. He was a journalist at a small but tenacious paper called the Richmond Clarion, run by a man named Bernard Keel. 62 years old, white, possessed of a moral stubbornness that his enemies called recklessness and his friends called courage. Bernard had published the paper through 2 fires, 1 lawsuit, and a period during which someone had arranged for his print supplier to suddenly stop doing business with him. Thomas had written for the Clarion under his own name since 1883. By 1887, he had published 41 articles, been threatened in writing 4 times, been followed on the street twice that he knew of, and built a reputation that was, in the specific and uncomfortable way such reputations build for black journalists in the post-Reconstruction South, both extremely valuable and extremely dangerous. His first step was the census records themselves. 3 weeks of correspondence. 2 trips, 1 to Richmond, 1 to Washington. Denied access twice. Partial access on the 3rd attempt. He obtained, through a combination of formal requests and the assistance of a sympathetic archivist, copies of both Carey's original field enumeration and the final submitted census record for the Southwest Virginia district. The discrepancy was exactly as Elias Voss had described. 13 names, 4 families, all from Hollow Creek. He traced the land challenge records. 6 weeks, through county offices variably cooperative, twice requiring the threat of publication to produce documents previously described as unavailable. He mapped Nance's filing history. He identified the pattern. He found Harwell's name in 3 separate documents he had no administrative reason to appear in. He found Joseph Carey, the original enumerator, living north of Richmond, working as a school teacher. Carey was 43 years old and frightened. He had known since 1870 that something had been done to his field records. He had filed a query about the discrepancy. He had been told it was a transcription issue, resolved. He had not believed this. He had also not pushed further. He agreed to speak with Thomas on the condition his name not appear in print. Thomas agreed. He had enough without it. He found Dorothy Greer, formerly of Hollow Creek, now of Philadelphia, through a chain of connections that took nearly 2 months to follow. Dorothy Greer was 56 years old. She had the quality that certain people develop after having had everything that could be taken from them removed. A stillness, a completeness, a kind of self-possession that comes not from comfort, but from having survived the worst thing you can imagine, and found that you are still there. She talked with Thomas for 4 hours. She told him about Abel Dupree, who had continued to believe, until the 28th day of the 30 days they had been given to vacate, that something could still be done, that the sheer documentation he had amassed constituted a record that some court, some official, some human being with the authority and the will would eventually be unable to ignore. On the 28th day, he packed his records into a trunk and carried them with him when they left, because he could not bring himself to leave behind the documentation of what had been done, even though there was nowhere left to bring it. She described the last meeting in the church, all 230 of them, those who were still there. 3 hours, Abel Dupree presenting the options in the same methodical way he presented everything. Contest the resolution in court, no lawyer, no funds, and the county court was not a neutral party. Appeal to federal authorities. The Bureau had demonstrated over 16 months exactly what it intended to do. Stay past the deadline. The notice had included a reference to county deputies present on the 30th day. She told Thomas what she had seen when she looked back, once, at the gate of the property as they left. The church was still standing. The school was still standing. The flag. We had a flag. We made it ourselves. Just a plain thing. It was still on the pole. She looked at Thomas. "I want people to know we built something real. Whatever happened to it, it was real. We built it, and it was real, and we did it ourselves, and no one can take that back." "That's what I want your article to say." Thomas wrote this down. Then, in the final weeks of the investigation, he found the misfiled letter. A letter from Warren Nance to Court Harwell, dated November 1869, filed, inexplicably, among administrative correspondence for a drainage project in a county 2 districts east of Hallow Creek, misfiled by someone in the records office whose error had become, across 18 years, the reason the letter still existed at all. The letter described the plan, the title review, the administrative delay, the coming state legislation. And it described, in language that was not the administrative language of careful implication, but the ordinary language of a man writing to someone he trusted completely, the expected outcome. The land will be available for reassessment in the 3rd quarter once the occupants have been administratively displaced. The improvements they have made will be assessed at reduced value given the disputed status, which means acquisition cost will remain favorable. V is prepared to move quickly when the time comes. It matched Elias Voss's transcription, word for word. In the margin, in a different hand, Harwell's, confirmed by comparison with other documents, a single notation. Agreed. Proceed as discussed. Thomas Dray brought all of it to Bernard Keel. Bernard read every word twice before speaking. "Can you prove this is accurate? Can you demonstrate it's a genuine reconstruction and not a fabrication?" Thomas had thought about this for 3 days. The original letter from the wall no longer existed. It had deteriorated beyond legibility during his investigation. What he had was a reconstructed document, supported by Ruth Colby's letters, Dorothy Greer's account of her conversation with Elias Voss, the Abel Dupree filing records, and the misfiled Nance Harwell letter, which was not a reconstruction but a primary document. "It's not enough to prove it in a court of law," Thomas said, "but it's enough to publish with the corroboration." Bernard looked at him for a long moment. "Get me a copy of the Verland bill. Write up your interview with Dorothy Greer in full. Every word. I want the discrepancy records verified with the archive in Maryland in writing." "I'll have all of it," Thomas said. "Then we publish," Bernard said. The first article in the series appeared in the Richmond Clarion on a Saturday morning in September 1887. It was titled simply, "A Letter Found in a Wall, The Destruction of Hallow Creek and the Men Who Ordered It." It ran 4 columns, front page. Within 48 hours, Thomas had received 3 letters threatening legal action and 1 letter from a congressman's office requesting a meeting, and 1 letter, handwritten, unsigned, postmarked from a town in Kentucky, that read, "I am glad the wall didn't hold forever." He knew who had written it. Chapter 2 follows what happened after the notice came.